have such sights to show you.
We're Poppin the Scary horror podcast here. I'm your host, Coale, and with me as always, I have my good friend and co-host, Aaron. How do you do?
I do.
Ooh, you do.
I do.
You do.
How Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
Ooh. Yeah, so I think with the current weather getting really cold right now, it's the kind of perfect feeling overall for the next movie we're going to watch today, which is Stanley Kubrick's 1980 hit, The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we discussed this afterwards, kind of similar with Alien, but you also watched The Shining.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I like movies enough that I've watched most of Kubrick's discography, so it's just, I don't think discography is the right word there.
So what do you think of just Stanley Kubrick as a director and filmmaker?
As a person,
Yeah.
he's an asshole.
Yeah.
As a director? No. I mean, he's excellent. Yeah, I mean, he makes great movies. I mean, Stanley Kubrick makes deep, cinematic masterpieces. And he's adapting a Stephen King novel, which is just like you just check all the boxes for a successful film. You're like, all right, if you are a filmmaker and you're like, gee golly whiz, I don't know what I can do to just rake in a bunch of awards. You just have to pick up a Stephen King novel and turn it into a movie.
Yeah, it's one of those things that adaptations as a whole for me are very hit and miss. Because personally, whenever it comes to an adaptation, I'm not looking for a verbatim by the book, every single thing in the pages in the movie.
Right.
However, what I do want is a good translation of it. Something that I feel like takes things from the book, and if they change it, it could possibly be for the better, potentially, or it just works better in a cinematic sense as opposed to a written in a novel sort of stance. Because personally, I think there's nothing wrong with making changes with a novel to a movie. However, you're going to have that direct comparison to do back and forth. But yeah, it's definitely interesting that Stanley Kubrick was interested in doing an adaptation of The Shining from Stephen King. And I mean, obviously, because you've seen it, and again, you weren't watching it because it's like, oh man, it's a horror film, I'm going to check this out here. It was just more so of the critical acclaim it has behind it that you sought it out. And did you ever have any kind of preconceived notions before you watch it, or any feelings that you had whenever you first watched the film?
Oh yeah, I guess the two things that I knew of just pop culture wise going in was here's Johnny, like cutting through with the axe in the door, and then the part with the twins and the sort of river of blood. Yeah, those are like the two things I had kind of seen beforehand but didn't have any context for.
Yeah.
And then the movie gave context for. I will say this is a film I've only seen once, and I watched it in college, so I don't remember everything about it, but it is, it's such a good movie that it's like, I feel like I do have moments that are sort of seared into my memory. So.
No, definitely for sure. With me, whenever it came to The Shining, it was very present from me at an early age, but not in the way that you think. Really, my first exposure to anything related to The Shining was the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror that they had, and they had like the parody where Homer's basically trapped up at the Overlook Hotel with his family, and then he starts to go insane and basically just start copying scenes from the movie and just making jokes. And as a kid, I thought it was hysterical, but I never really got into context of, oh, this is based on an actual movie. And obviously, being a little kid, I was definitely not even going to get away with watching The Shining. I was already kind of, playing it dangerous watching The Simpsons over at my friend's house, but whenever I did finally get old enough to watch the film, It was definitely a crazy experience, and one that I've gone back to on multiple occasions. Like, I showed my wife the movie, and so I'm really excited to go back. It's been like a while since I've seen it, and it's just one of those films I'm like, man, I really want to watch The Shining. So whenever I was lining up the episode specifically, I was like, okay, we're getting to the winter months. I think now's a perfect time to kind of pull the trigger on being able to talk about The Shining and watching it again and just getting that good old refresher and whatnot.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Good stuff. It's good stuff. I think I whenever I watched it in college, I watched it under the context that I was going to be a writer one day, and so it was interesting to have that sort of comparison with the main character, and the all work and no play makes Johnny a dull boy. Obviously, I've long abandoned those dreams, but just like some other dreams, I guess, are long abandoned in the frigid north of this movie. But it'll be interesting to watch it under a different context, where I'm in a different stage in my life, and where I've forgotten most of the plot, but remember some of those iconic moments.
I think it'll definitely be great to kind of watch it, and again, have a sort of different kind of horror film going into it, as opposed to the usual stuff I've been showing you in this podcast as of currently. So so we're gonna go ahead and head on over and watch Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and let you know how it goes.
Yep.
Woo! It goes. Yep. Snap, crackle, pop, Bratz, Krispies. So we are back from watching The Shining. So Aaron, how was it heading back up to the Overlook Hotel?
It was the shining star.
That's cute.
It was great. It's a good movie.
No, it definitely is. It's one of those things that, going into Alien, how I told you I was going in kind of finding out a way for me to hate it. I just didn't even try. Like, already whenever it has that establishing music at the beginning, I'm like, all right, I'm smitten.
Yeah.
Like, it's just one of those films that, it hits the right mood immediately for me and takes me in. But then again, I have seen it multiple times, so now I've just been kind of conditioned to feel that way specifically.
Right.
Whenever I do watch this film specifically. So I had an excellent time, and it's always an easy watch for me. And it's actually a pretty long film, 2.5 hours, but it goes by smoothly.
It's a big one for sure. Yeah, and it's one of those movies that. So every time I watch a Stanley Kubrick film, he has this like a style, right? But he does magical realism in such a way that's like iconic, and it's always a joy to jump back into that. You know what I mean? It's like, this is the real world, and then it just slowly devolves until you get, like weird people in furry masks eating someone out on a bed or whatever, and you're like, all right, it just gets weird, and every time you whip up a Kubrick film, it's gonna get weird.
Absolutely. That is definitely, it's such a weird film, because The Shining as a whole, whenever it comes to it, it's a film where people who watch it are either going to love it or hate it, or just be confused.
I guess so.
Or maybe just a little bit of both on each party.
Yeah.
And stuff specifically, because whenever it comes to films and there is like a lot of substance and it's not straightforward and it's stuff to dig into, it's very hit or miss with me. Again, I've mentioned before in previous episodes, Donnie Darko's my favorite movie, and it's kind of similar to that. And The Shining definitely joins alongside Donnie Darko as being one of the films that just hits with me at all levels. I mean, if you even look to my right, I have a couple of Funko figures of Jack and Wendy over there specifically. So, I definitely like The Shining a ton. I feel like it hits all the right notes specifically. Like, every aspect of filming, just, it hits every notch. And again, I'm not even a big Stanley Kubrick guy specifically. I've watched 2001 Space Odyssey and his other flicks. And, they're enjoyable and stuff, but there's just something specific about The Shining that just struck me and has always stayed with me, and it's just one of those films that will continue to stick with me.
Right. I think that the line that runs across a lot of his films is just tension. He's really good at tension, and that sort of key surrealism that we were talking about, which just that you kind of touched on a little bit can turn some people off. I think if you're someone who hasn't watched this film, but you have watched like 2001: A Space Odyssey or Eyes Wide Shut or something like that, and you're like, is it gonna be like that? I think the answer is yes, but not as much. You know what I mean? It's not 2001: A Space Odyssey, where like I feel like that movie did a lot of surrealism for surrealism's sake. You know what I mean? It's like absurd for absurd's sake almost, and there's like a touch of that because I don't think you ever escape that whenever watching. I mean, I'm not super familiar with everything. The disclaimer that Stanley Kubrick's made, but. The line that I've seen through his work is, I think that is something that might be a criticism I'd bring up of Stanley Kubrick. Is sometimes he just does a little bit of surrealism for surrealism's sake. You know,
sure.
Just a little weird just to be weird. With the furry guy.
Like there's definite moments of that throughout The Shining, specifically.
But it's not as bad as like 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh my gosh.
There's not a moment in this film where I was like, just like, what the fuck's going on? You know what I mean? And that's every time I watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, that's probably how I feel. I'm just like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah, I'm so glad I'm not alone in that. I've only talked about 2001: A Space Odyssey with a couple of peeps, and so I have an interesting story I might as well just interject into this episode, because I don't know when we'll ever talk about that, if ever. So I had gotten it on disc from Netflix, like back whenever they would mail the disc in, because I was kind of going through a similar thing you were, where I'm like, I need to watch all the classic films, all the films you see where they make references to everything. So 2001: Space Odyssey was one of them. Well, I had it for a while, because it was one of those things I'm like, oh, I'll get to watching it. I woke up, like, I don't know if I had a nightmare or something, but it was like 1, 2, 3 a.m. It was like that time of night where even if you've been awakened at that time, or you've just stayed awake up to that point, it's like that weird hour specifically.
Yeah.
And for some reason, with my sleep-deprived mind, after waking up, I'm like, man, I feel like watching a movie. I'm going to watch 2001: A Space Odyssey.
That's the perfect time to watch that movie.
Dude, I have not watched it since then. Because towards the end, it's just like, what is going on?
Yeah. It's just, it's like 3 different movies mashed into one movie. They just jump around time periods, and none of it, it's all connected through a very loose string, and that's a trip.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is The Shining.
Oh yeah, no, get this bad boy back on track.
With Knack Jickelson and Jelly Shuval.
Yeah, we can talk about the actors. I might as well give a premise of the overall story first before. Yeah, so as Aaron's mentioned before, this is a adaptation of Stephen King's novel The Shining that he wrote. And interesting tidbit I might as well throw in here. I guess whenever it came to Stanley Kubrick, obviously you know this, he's an interesting cat.
Yeah.
Had a certain way about doing things specifically. But I guess whenever he was looking for inspiration or something to do his movie, he wanted to do an adaptation. And so he would look at books and then read a couple pages. If he didn't like it, he just threw it. Like did that. And I guess one of the assistants specifically said whenever she heard the thudding stop, she walked in and saw that he was looking at The Shining specifically. So how he takes the story specifically, because there are subtle differences between the novel and the movie, is that Jack Torrance is hired to watch the Overlook Hotel, which closes during the winter months specifically because the weather gets so terrible up there that it would cost the hotel way more money for maintenance, trying to keep it all down. So they closed it
really high in the Colorado mountains, in the Rockies or whatever.
Absolutely. So they close it from like the end of October and don't open till like May 1st. And because he's a writer, he's like, heck, this is great. I can be secluded, no distractions or anything. I can write the story specifically, and I'll bring my wife and kiddo up specifically. And so, even though Danny has a little bit of second thoughts about it due to his friend Tony, who is his imaginary friend
Yes,
that
Danny's
speaks
the
through.
child. Yeah, he's probably like what, like I don't know, 10, 8, 9.
Yeah,
something.
he looks like that or younger.
Oh
Definitely
yeah,
younger.
probably like, maybe like 6, maybe 6 or 7.
And then Wendy Torrance, who is the mom, played by Shelley Duvall, as mentioned previously, they tag along with Jack Nicholson, and as they're staying at the hotel, it just starts to slowly unwind and questions pop up, a lot of unsteadiness, that's the word I'm looking for, starts to set in, and you're just kind of there experiencing what they're experiencing,
Yeah.
which is weird again, because really nothing's quote unquote after them or trying to get them.
Right.
It's just more everything slowly setting in specifically.
Yeah, it's
so
the isolationism, it's the cabin fever, as they say in the beginning of the movie, where they all start to get a little restless, being kind of trapped in this hotel that has a little bit of character itself.
Oh, yeah.
Hotel itself.
And I think that's the thing that makes The Shining specifically a special adaptation is it's not just straightforward like, oh, there's nobody there. Because Stanley Kubrick does throw in a lot of these supernatural elements that throw in, but it's not like so much in your face. You're like, okay, there's ghosts here specifically. It dances on a very, very, very thin line between the fact of, are they actually there or are the characters just imagining it?
Right.
It just dances on that line basically throughout the majority of the film. Once they're at the Overlook Hotel just to settled in there specifically, it plays that fine line to where even as the audience, and even if you've seen it multiple times, you're never really quite sure where to feel on what exactly is real and what isn't.
Yeah.
And so I think it establishes more as opposed to like having like some slasher or spooky ghost come after you, but it also isn't just, human nature by itself. It just mixes this stuff. And again, you've mentioned before, Stanley Kubrick does throw in all these things which normally would, in my opinion, throw the story off from being told and being coherent. But it really doesn't bother me too much. Like I said, I know you keep mentioning the bear scene specifically, and although it is definitely like, what the hell am I watching?
That's the one I probably would have cut. All the other ones were like awesome, but that's the one that I was like, you're just being silly.
No, yeah, I would definitely say that's maybe one scene, like if I had to cut one scene out, probably that scene, because it doesn't add too much. Just have Wendy running up the staircase and then just continuing on. I think that would have been fine, but
I get it because that's in the overall, like, the hotel is sort of revealing itself to her, so that's like one of the scenes of many, but it's like kind of the first, and it's just like a little jarring for Wendy anyway.
And I guess with the story, the thing that's weird about this film as compared to other ones where it's like, oh, it's just a killer loose at a camp, fight. This one, we can focus more specifically on the story in the fact that because Stanley Kubrick has thrown in these random stuff, because he has specifically chosen to focus on certain aspects, it's led to many conspiracy theories to even be present throughout the film specifically, because actually two of them specifically that are popular is the fact that they talk about the Overlook Hotel being built on an Indian burial ground, and there's a lot of Native American art throughout the hotel, and so they've mentioned that they believe that it's a message about Indian genocide that happened here in America. And again, this is like fan theories that are thrown out specifically, and even the moon landing being fake, because you see like Danny the little boy wearing the NASA sweater with the Apollo rocket, and so because of like random stuff like this, it's allowed people to really just dig into the story and just keep dissecting it. And while personally, whenever it comes to the conspiracies, I'm not too big on it per se. I kind of like the more so just more apparent messages. I don't like looking at Because that was always my thing in humanities, whenever people would be like, "Oh yes, the person made the carpet red to symbolize this."
Well, I think
Or-
those are two different
yeah.
things. Yeah. I agree with you there. I don't think Stanley Kubrick made this movie to make the audience understand that the moon landing was fake. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's funny to think about that kind of stuff and point out the clues that might support that evidence. But, like, if you genuinely believe those sorts of theories, then you might be like, might want to watch the movie again without that lens and just check yourself. But, I mean, talking about, you know, the red carpet versus, you know, blood or whatever. I mean, I think it's very intentional, and you can see it very physically here with some of the shots that they lined up, the differences between the rooms, the way they framed up, and how color is used in this film specifically, since you used that example. The red elevators and the that, you know, sort of decaying green bathroom that not to spoil too many things, but like the what goes along with those, the mood that's given with that, even when he's in the bathroom with that guy, the butler guy, you know, and that bathroom.
Oh yeah, Grady.
With Grady, and he steps out of the golden room into this red bathroom, and it's like modern and like. It just looks like blood flowing through the wall. Like that's what because it's just the white urinals and stuff, and then everything else is just like red flashed on top of it. I mean, those sorts of things I'm all about. I love digging into that kind of stuff because that's all very intentional from a director standpoint, especially whenever you think about Stanley Kubrick, who was so nitty gritty about the details.
He was definitely a very particular director whenever it came to stuff, and I've heard that he was also pretty dadgum difficult to work with, which I'll probably mention a lot of instances where that became slowly apparent. But yeah, like visually, like I take in more so, again, like one of my favorite spots is that carpet that's by the room 237 with like the red diamond and the orange and brown stuff like that. I feel like thematically helps establish a tone. I guess whenever I was talking about like, you know, oh yes, like I'm talking about people that are focusing on stuff that isn't even relevant to the story specifically. Yeah, so just
deep into the symbols and not to the plot that's on the page.
Yeah, exactly. So that's more what I was referring to, because the color coordination of the film definitely helps establish feeling and overall just underlying tones that they're trying to deliver. Because again, the dialogue never really is explicitly on the nose specifically. They kind of dance around it, but because of the establishing shots with the colors they're using, it definitely helps convey that tone. So I think whenever it comes to story, I think it's definitely very impressive that Stanley Kubrick took this, because the novel is a little more straightforward, as this is more abstract specifically. And so I feel like because he was able to throw in stuff like, I'm sure that bear has a purpose there and has an underlying tone, but at the same time, like, I can't say I hate it because I remember it, but at the other time, I'm like, too much. Like, pull it back, Kubrick.
Yeah, that might be one moment where I think he should reel it back. But yeah, this movie has a lot of those sorts of moments. I love that you mentioned the carpet, and because we spent a lot of time sort of focused at that level, you know, following Danny behind on the tricycle, and I think the two things that I would love to point out about this movie, that's really just the sign of a great movie where you can sort of dig into and appreciate these details. Two things that I think, two departments that I think this movie did incredibly well in that I don't really think about with other movies is sound design and casting. Both of those were just amazing.
No, I definitely agree with that.
And I just thought about sound design, even just thinking about the tricycles. There's a moment where they just focus on him, just the brr as he goes over the hardwood, and then he goes onto the carpet, and they just focus on that for like 30 seconds as you follow Danny, just like writing the durr and then silent durr, and it's just like that natural sound that they use in conjunction with the awesome music and ambience that they pump in to just make that so much of this content is not intense if not for the sound design. You know what I mean?
No, for sure. I think that's definitely something to take away from there, because it was funny, while watching the film, it reminded me of this movie I had watched previously called Hausu. I don't know if you know about it. You've probably seen a lot of the Criterion art where it's like that big kind of like orange I always thought it was a fox, but I guess it's a cat with like gnarly teeth specifically. But anyways, I watched the movie and I wasn't really a big fan of it. I know a lot of people are specifically, and the thing that bothered me was the brash noises that accompanied the film and everything else. And so Randy, that's actually one of his favorite films. He was telling me, he's like, oh, well, it helps to establish like disorientation, feeling unsteady. And I'm like, right. But then I listened to The Shining and it has music almost similar to it, but it doesn't grate in the sense of like, I'll make it stop.
Right.
It again, I feel like establishes way better just that sense of unsteadiness. And that's really freaking hard to do with the music they had and sound design and everything else. Like it could be grating on the ears. And again, it's not like music to your ears by any means.
No.
But it helps just like establish it. Like I've seen this movie multiple times and there's so many sound cues and everything that still causes me to tense up. And again, it's not even that I'm afraid of watching it. It just has that big flowing sense of uneasiness going through. And so that's actually one of my favorite things too, is whenever Danny's riding around on his bike and the plastic wheels are like hitting the wooden floor, and then whenever it gets to the carpet, it just goes silent. And it's just like the sweet, like really light. Like I'm sure some people might look at it and be like, oh, like, well, that was weird and stuff. And it is weird because normally you don't ever get shots like that in a lot of movies, but because he took the time to do that specifically, and it really helps just establish the overall tonal vibe of the Overlook Hotel, because it's just the Torrance family, just the three of them, and nobody else, or at least it seems like it's nobody else, or is it? Again, it just plays that certain line, but the sound design definitely hits it out of the park, and that soundtrack is good, because really the only music you ever get is at the very beginning, with like that low synth noise playing, which I love a ton. But the rest is just noise. But again, it is almost like has that musical attribute to it.
Well, and it does. Some of it is musical, right? It's orchestral. It's harsher strings and it's horns that blare really loud. It is a soundtrack you're listening to at some parts. Some parts it is just noise, and other parts it is a soundtrack. But I think to its credit is that you don't notice. You're like, this isn't this is the reprisal of the theme for The Shining. You know what I mean? As the intense climax comes to a close. No, it's like, it's just intensity, and it's just something you feel, and it's very visceral. So
no, that's definitely a point. And I think we've hit a lot of the bullet points with the story. Again, it's one of those films where I feel like I could just vomit everything I like and think about this film. So with the casting, you might as well go to the characters overall. So I feel like definitely we might as well just talk about the overall face everyone associates The Shining with, and it is Jack Nicholson's portrayal as Jack Torrance. And you actually had a very interesting thing you noticed about Jack Nicholson and the roles he plays specifically. I know you mentioned at the beginning, like the types of characters he plays.
Yeah, he always secretly hates everybody around him. He's never like buddies with somebody and like genuinely, you know what I mean? He's always like, yeah, buddy. That's how he delivers like every line. So like the first scene you see with him with his family really is when they're driving up to the hotel, and his kid's like, I'm hungry, and he's like, then you should have ate breakfast. Like you can tell with the first interaction that he just fucking hates his family. Yeah. But he's not like has the axe out and is getting chopping, you know what I mean? He's just like, you should have fucking ate something. And that's like always the character he plays. Always my number one pick for racist main character, but that's not the plot point. You just assume if Jack Nicholson's on screen, he's a racist. Oh my god! It might not have anything to do with the plot. And that was true in this movie too. He's a fucking racist. Didn't have that much to do with the plot, but they snuck it in there for some reason.
It's one of those interesting things with me with Jack Nicholson's portrayal as Jack Torrance, because whenever I first watched it, I was like, oh man, he's incredible and everything. But it's kind of weird. It's like one of those things that I think, like, as I get older, as I've seen other movies, had more life experiences, stuff like that, his performance again is super stellar and everything else. But like, again, I had never really picked up the fact that at the very beginning, again, Jack Nicholson, I think in every role has like a heightened bit of like craziness to him,
he's a little
specifically
cartoonish. Yeah, he's
a little bit,
cartoonish.
but at the same time, I just almost wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, no.
That's the
He's
weird
perfect.
thing about it. But the thing that I've noticed specifically is the fact that he isn't just like the lovable dad, that
No.
can't do no wrong. It's definitely a flawed family, specifically, which they
Mhm.
do throw hints at very subtly, which Shelley Duvall does a wonderful job kind of throwing in those hints about him, specifically whenever she has the doctor over and she's asking questions.
Mhm.
Again, setting it up, but it's definitely interesting because he's not a very sympathetic character too much. I mean, at the same time, you want him to feel like, okay, like you want him to be like a good dad
Right,
and
right.
everything, but that's just not how he even starts the film at. And whenever that sense of cabin fever starts to settle in on everybody, specifically, it definitely does not get him any closer to being dad of the year,
No.
specifically. But it's one of those weird things that I don't think for this film specifically he should be that good of a dad, because again, I think
No,
we do
of
see it
course
too
not,
many
yeah.
times where you have like this, dad who could do no wrong, maybe a couple of flaws, and then all of a sudden just goes
Then
down
there's a turn, you know what I mean?
a wrong path.
Right, they establish very early that like he has hurt his kid before, and
Mhm.
it's one of those things where like you don't just like loathe the dude
Mhm.
because it seems like the way they gave it in context is like he was kind of had an alcohol problem and now he's getting over it and trying
Yeah.
to get better, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
But it definitely just they do a lot in little moments to set up
Mhm.
that he's like not a great guy, but he's not awful, but he's just like he's a flawed guy.
Yeah, which is very hard to do
Yeah.
because again, there's only 3 characters you focus a majority on specifically, and I think it's really hard to nail the character perfectly to where
Mhm.
you're watching this guy who isn't a very good dude overall, but at the same time you're not like, "Oh my god, I'm so sick of him."
Right.
Because it is Jack Nicholson. He just has that charm of like
Mhm.
he's the lovable jerk
Yeah.
at the beginning, but then like as kind of the more darker tones really start setting in and starting to show on Jack Torrance as a whole, again, you're not like it's again, it's like that weird thing where he definitely starts to slowly bring out like the inner evil with him
Right.
specifically, but at the same time you're not like, "Oh my god, I'm just tired of this dude already." Like, no, you're just there along with him in the ride, and I think
Right.
that definitely helps out. It's not like you spend the majority of the time seeing his character develop, because again, I think that's the point of The Shining, is just this is Jack's journey he's going through as he's basically encountering his demons.
Yeah, he's encountering his demons, and it seems almost like he's talking to the hotel in a sense, and the hotel talks back. I mean, literally, he talks to these ghosts of the hotel, I guess you could call them. That are the audience is left wondering, like, is this something magical about the hotel, or is this in his head? Is he talking to himself? You know what I mean? But the way they used that is much more clever of a device, and much more interesting and engaging of a device than just him walking around a room monologuing like I'm going out of my mind or whatever. And so that's what makes that's part of the brilliance of this movie. But
Yeah, so I think whenever it comes to his character, I think that is a strong point, that he doesn't need to speak it, he just shows it specifically, and you know exactly what he's thinking. You know exactly, there's no surprise whenever you get to the end of the film that he got to where he is. There's, it's like the Breaking Bad effect, basically, where you watch it and you slowly see Walter White slowly become just the entity that is Heisenberg, specifically. And so I think that's definitely super mad props to Jack Nicholson, which again, I mean, there's definitely points where he does ham it up a tiny bit, like
he can't
towards the
not
very
ham it
end, but it somehow works. It's like the craziest thing for me.
I think honestly what makes it work a lot, because I mean, this is early 80s film. It has that sort of 70s 80s feel. just in the beginning where he's like in a job interview and they're doing job interview stuff. That's that's like perfect Jack Nicholson stuff for me too, where there's just like, well, I love that, you know. And he's just like, I'm a very lovable guy, but you see on his face he's just like kind of animated and cartoonish a little bit, but also like dead inside. He's got that Nicholson vibe. I love it so much where he's talking to the guy in the job interview and. Well, I understand why they left you to tell that story. You know, that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's like, he's perfect for that. But you could just tell behind his eyes, he's like, I just need a job so I can write. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's, I think, what helps the film out is the fact that it is believable that Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance would take it. Because, again, literally the owners had to tell him, look, this guy went crazy and killed his family and then killed himself. And he's like, well, ain't that something?
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
And like the cartoonishness of Jack Nicholson's like appreciated there. I think that's a good way to... That's a good character for him to be in. And that's what I mean whenever it's like, when I talk about casting, like, I can't imagine Jack Torrance as anybody but Jack Nicholson.
No, absolutely. And I guess that was kind of like one of the issues is the fact that the novel sense, Jack Torrance in that is much more of a regular everyday man, which is what Stephen King envisioned. But Stanley Kubrick was like, I want Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
I want Jack Nicholson. And so I think it's just one of those crazy things that just works specifically. Like, because if he wrote it on paper, like, man goes to a hotel and starts to see things that start going crazy, you would not think Jack Nicholson.
Right.
Yeah, he's not like one of the...
I even think that, like, if somebody... Nobody else could make this film, first off. Like, Stanley Kubrick's the only one that... Plenty of people could make a fine adaptation of The Shining, I'm sure. Nobody else would think to make this film.
Yes.
Because I think even with the script, even if you wrote out the exact script of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and plopped it in front of somebody, they would not produce anything remotely close to what he made. Not just because, like, I'm not saying he's the only creative genius out there.
Oh, for sure.
I'm just saying, like, the ways that they... Because, like, the words on paper are not that interesting, right? I think spoken, I think acted, they're all... It's an excellent movie. But I think if you just, you know, if you cast some random guy to chop down the door and say, here's Johnny, you know, it probably would come out as a really hokey B film, you know?
Yeah.
But it's the attention to detail, it's the casting, it's the sound design, it's all these elements that are really focused on and made sure to be made perfect that comes together to make this experience of the film.
Absolutely. And it's funny whenever you mention the doors and the line, here's Johnny, which everyone really knows that. They've seen the joke, so it's hard to kind of say spoiler whenever it's just apparent in media. But it's funny because 2 fun facts I learned about that. Apparently he was... used to be like a volunteer fireman, and so he knew how to chop down a door.
Yeah, it seems like he was doing that right, where he's cutting out that little wood panel and then reaching in to unlock it.
And I guess he was breaking away too easy to where he had to chop down 60 doors altogether for that shot.
60?
Yes, yeah. 60. And the line, here's Johnny, apparently was improvised, and so Stanley Kubrick, for some reason, was like, yeah, that'll work.
Yeah, because nobody's named Johnny.
Yeah, it was like the Johnny Carson show. It was just like a throwaway line. So just fun facts overall there. But yeah, so I definitely think Jack Nicholson gives probably his best performance. I don't think there's been ever any performance that like has topped this one. There's some that have gotten close, but for me...
I'd have to rewatch, like, because when I think Jack Nicholson, I think of this movie, and I think of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. They're both really top-notch Jack Nicholson movies. But...
Yeah. I would need to watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That's always been on my hit list.
You haven't watched it?
No, I haven't watched it.
I put them at the same... I haven't watched it recently, so maybe I can't do that, but I would think they're at the same level.
I'll try to watch it before we record our next episode and just kind of let you know how I feel.
It's another one of those movies where I'm like, I can't imagine this character being anybody but Jack Nicholson.
That's terrific.
He's just stellar, because he's like a guy in a nut house, and it's like, that's where Jack Nicholson
But, anyway. Yeah, so, and I'm going to move on over to the leading lady, that is Shelley Duvall as Wendy Torrance. And for me, yeah, exactly. So that's the thing that's crazy about this film. Whenever I first watched The Shining, I really liked Jack Torrance's character going through it. And then after seeing it a few more times, it kind of slowly shifted to where I was more so watching Shelley Duvall's performance than Jack Nicholson. Not to say, again, Jack Nicholson did perfect.
No, yeah,
like,
right.
I literally can't say anything like that. I'm just like, that didn't work. He just nails it out of the park. But Shelley Duvall brings, like, a great performance to this film, and a well-needed one as well, because really for the overall story arc that is given with the Shining, it's important to have a character like her specifically there, because really, like, looking at her specifically, she has to be kind of the one that's holding the family together, because again, like, Danny is like a little kid, doesn't really understand, but understands a little bit.
And he's also, like, having some sort of, like, mental episodes that, like, the severity of which is hard for the family to tell throughout.
Yes.
But
and so she's having to do that while also trying just to be a loving, supportive wife to Jack Nicholson, who, again, we've already established he's not like Dudley well, I guess Dudley Do-Right's kind of a screw up, like Mr. Perfect or anything. No. Definitely not that. And so, again, and you could easily just be like, oh, like, strong woman. Like, she is no, like, Ripley whatsoever, but I don't think the story needs a Ripley.
No.
And again, I think Shelley Duvall, it's hard to do what she did because she has to be kind of more of the, like, doormat wife specifically, while also having to step up constantly to try to do her best and be the best wife and mother that she can be. And so
it's a terrible role to be in real life, to have to to be this person that has to draw the line in the sand for not only yourself, but to have a kid that you believe in more than you. And to step up to an alcoholic, abusive husband.
Yeah, and it's like there's never a switch that flips with her. She's like, I'm a badass now.
No, right?
No,
right.
like this is like not her forte. Whenever she does have to step up and do stuff, which again, I think it's perfect. I think too many films, like, they'll take it and they're like, oh, this is the moment where they stand up and do that, which is nothing wrong. But for this film, I think just having Wendy Torrance just be on that exact same line works out immensely. Which here's the thing that blew my mind. Apparently, with Shelley Duvall's performance, she was nominated for a Razzie, if you know what that is. So the Razzies are, like, basically like the Oscars, but for bad movies or bad actresses. But she was nominated for it specifically, which and so that's a thing that I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? I felt like she honestly gave even more than Jack Nicholson did.
Yeah.
Specifically. And not to say he didn't try. He definitely threw his acting chops there, and you could tell he was giving 112%. But I think for her, she especially had to do it, because Jack Nicholson just goes crazy. He just goes nuts. Like, sky's the limit. Whereas she has to, like, be stable, unstable, stable throughout the entire thing, which is a very hard thing to do. As an actress, and that's kind of the unfortunate thing about it, is that whenever she did have to go through filming, she had the absolute worst time with it, because Stanley Kubrick was not very nice to her at all specifically, which again, people allegedly think that Stanley Kubrick purposely kind of mistreated her and had, like, cast members not even talk to her just to kind of set in that overall mood, because I guess that's the idea he had for all the actors, is for not a lot of people to talk to him, so they had that sense of isolation. But it was especially apparent with Shelley Duvall. Like, he had nobody talk to her, so she's by herself doing these scenes emotionally over and over and over again, because as you know, he redid takes multiple times. In fact, that one scene where she has the bat and she's going up the stairs, that was shot 127 times. Yeah, and so she was basically exhausted and got sick multiple times. And so she had a lot of friends trying to tell her, like, look, I think you need to drop out of this production. I think it's going to, be bad. This is bad for your health, and we care about you. And she's like, no, I'm going to keep doing the film. And so I think it's hard for her to especially just keep getting back up whenever Stanley Kubrick's knocking her down. And ethically, I'm very mixed about situations like this whenever they go over the top, like just shooting production wise. It's like that scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the dinner table. It took like a day of filming, like a full 23-hour shift where everyone's literally going insane there.
Mm-hmm.
And so while it is questionable, like whenever they start to do stuff like that specifically, at the same time, it just works so dang well.
Right.
Like that's the difficult thing about it, because the amount of like emotional stress you see clearly on her face, and just the words she's speaking, because she's had to speak this line hundreds and hundreds of times basically.
Mm-hmm.
It just leads to a great performance. Not to say that she couldn't have one before then, but it's like that weird like line specifically.
Right.
It's like, that was great, but was it worth it?
Mm-hmm. Like, I'm glad that we have like psych experiment ethics now, but I'm also glad we learned things from Baby Albert.
Yes. Yeah, it's like that weird line there, because I don't want to be like, oh yeah, I'm glad Stanley Kubrick put her through hell.
Right. I'm glad we learned the science we learned with the Stanford prison experiment, but
yeah,
it never needs to happen again.
No, that's exactly how I feel about it, because again, I feel like this film is just kind of one of those films that nobody can recreate.
Yeah.
Like, they can try, but it just will not work. And so just the amount of turmoil Shelley Duvall had to go through this role, and again, to overall, whenever it came out, just being nominated as worst actress, and people are like, oh my god, she's terrible. Even Stephen King said that he did not like what they did with Wendy Torrance, that she was basically a dish rag wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's definitely unfair, because she doesn't give up. She
Right.
keeps like powering through, even though it's not in her nature to do so. Again, because she's just trying to be the best mom she can be. And I love that even with her, she's not like, just she's perfect in every way. I mean,
No.
she has like her own weaknesses also. Again, you'll see a lot of times whenever she's really starting to get stressed out, she starts smoking specifically. And so that's just kind of like her relapse. And again, she isn't one to try to stand up. And whenever she does stand up, she's like, again, not even 100% sure on it.
Right.
As opposed to like, say, Ripley in Alien, where it's like 112% like,
Right.
nope, just not having any BS go on specifically. But yeah, every time I watch The Shining, a deeper appreciation just grows on me on Shelley Duvall's performance. And in all honesty, she's probably my favorite character to watch in The Shining, because I feel like she has the most difficult role. And while again, Jack Nicholson again is also terrific, and I enjoy seeing him, I pay a lot more attention to the subtle things she does. Like, again, even at the beginning of the film, she has to be emotionally unstable, but not how she is towards the end of the film, which is very, very, very hard to do, just to have that balance. So I definitely respect the hell out of her for this performance she did.
Yeah.
And so I guess we'll jump over, because I know you've mentioned it a couple of times, but with Danny, child actors are definitely weird, in the fact that I feel like they're very hit or miss. Sometimes I feel like they'll give a good performance, and then otherwise, I mean, they're just a little kid, they don't have like years of acting behind them.
They don't have that much of a range. They're pretty much talking lines.
Yeah. And so there is definitely a lot of moments specifically with Danny where I felt like, okay, I could tell he's acting or trying his best, but it doesn't like pull me out of the film entirely, specifically.
And I think it's actually really impressive that Danny, for however young he was, could do like he had Danny, and then he had his Tony mode. And like there's like a distinct difference even in their mannerisms. You could tell when he's being Tony or when he's being Danny, and like because there are times where in the movie where he's Tony the whole time.
Yes.
And then he will snap out of it at the reaction to some sort of stimulus, and then he's like a scared child, and you can actually see that on his face and stuff, which is probably the product of hundreds of takes, but
yes,
it is very impressive for a kid actor to pull that off. So.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I've heard about this before, but with Stanley Kubrick, he kind of grew attached to Danny, and the actor's name is actually Danny.
Right.
Apparently he grew very attached to him and was very protective of him, and didn't really want him to see a lot of the horrific stuff that happened. So a lot of the scenes where he's supposed to be scared of something or anything, he's not seeing the horrific carnage going on in front of him. And so I think for not I mean, that's a weird thing about Stanley Kubrick is like who he'll choose to be protective over and who he'll basically throw to the dogs, all in the name of filmmaking, which makes him very divisive with me personally. But I think Danny is definitely likable, and you do care about him getting out, and you do wonder, like, you know, how does his power he have going to affect him overall and his journey? Because again, like, you look at his parents, you know, Jack Nicholson, you know, he tries to be a good dad, but just isn't a little bit.
Like, kind of,
Yeah, and then with Shelley Duvall, you feel like she's super trying her absolute best to take care, but again, she can't even really feel like she takes care of herself overall, and so it makes it a very emotionally unstable relationship he's going through. So you do want to see him be well and everything, and you know, again, you're just kind of experiencing it through his eyes, because that's kind of the weird thing. You're going through different journeys with each of the three characters specifically and seeing their points of view. So I think that's a crazy thing about The Shining, is that they'll show these three different perspectives that are just going along with one another. And so I think it definitely helps having like these multitude of characters, and again, just having Danny overall, because really he doesn't have like a big strong personality. He's very just introverted and everything, and unsure, and again, it makes sense given his how he's grown up and everything else. So I think he overall does a pretty good job, even though there are scenes that are a little tiny bit hokey, but again, it really is one of those things that I wouldn't have it any other way. Like, it just somehow works perfectly with this film specifically.
Yeah, I don't even know that I noticed any like super hokey parts, just because I mean, it's kid actor, and I think once you see enough children on screen, you know they're not going to be, you know, winning Oscars, but it sold it and it never took it out of the movie for me.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely, absolutely. And while this character isn't in the film too terribly long, there is like one honorable mention I do have to mention, and that is Scatman Crothers' performance as Halloran.
Yeah, the head cook.
Yep, the head cook. I feel like he adds like a more of a sense of levity at the beginning, while also trying to help Danny understand exactly what all he's going through.
Yeah, I actually really like the way that it was handled. Just where, you know, his parents are off seeing the different parts, and they sits down for ice cream, and he's like, you know how I knew to call you this nickname, you know? And it adds that little bit of, there's like a little bit of mystery magic with Danny, but that is, and that gives the film its name, you know, The Shining. You have a shining about you, or whatever, that he's talking to Danny about. But it's such an interesting movie, because even though, like, that could have easily been the focal point of the movie, and it probably would have been a worse movie because of it. But it's just like a little mystery thread where, like, you don't even really know what it means to have the Shining, or what that power can do, or whatever. They just know that there's like a link between the head chef and the boy, and that they can sort of like communicate with each other without being around each other. And that really only comes to play in a very, I mean, in the scope of the movie, a pretty minor part of it, even though it could have been a major part, you know. So not to give anything away, I don't want to say too much about that if you haven't seen the movie and want to, but just know that it's a part that's always, it's a piece that's always in play, and you're just wondering, like, what is the deal with this? And in the end, like, does it, you know, I don't know. It's a cool part of the magical realism.
No, it really is, specifically, and I will mention some other things about Scatman and his performance, but to add on to that specifically, the film, I feel like, does throw in this stuff. You know, like how films can kind of become formulaic and be like, oh, you have this, use this if you need to.
Right.
Like,
use the Force to guide your missile.
That's the thing about this film. It throws the formula out the window. There is no formula with this. And so even though it does throw in stuff which normally they would emphasize heavier, that Danny has a power and like to use it, I feel like this film uses it without giving away what's going to happen in the future, which again, I think that's a very strong point.
And even with the ways that they foreshadow things, some of them are like more literal than others, right? Like, take for example the Indian burial ground thing you mentioned.
Yeah.
Really is just kind of like adds a sense of foreboding and doesn't. It's not like Indians rise from the ground and tomahawk people to death. That plays almost no role in it except to give like a foreboding. But one could think, there might be some sort of Indian spiritual thing that comes into play,
right?
And then think about that versus the example of like the last groundskeeper killed his family with an axe or something, and it's like, well, maybe that mystery has more credence to this story.
Yeah.
So it's like there's like little things that they sprinkle in the beginning that all serve an objective, but it's not like what a lesser movie might do and just kind of like spell it out. And some movies we've watched, honestly, that are kind of like, they say something and you're like, oh, well, that's gonna happen later.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they do a good job of like setting up the intensity with these really natural feeling moments that like some of them come to pass and many of them don't do anything except for to fill the vessel that is the hotel with mystery.
Yeah. And yeah, I definitely could not agree with more of those points you made there specifically. I don't have a good transition talking about Scatman. I'm really sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
He's great. He's the Scatman.
No, yeah.
It's a difference. Yeah.
I feel like his inclusion to the story is kind of good because, in all honesty, it feels like it provides us a break specifically from what is going on at the Overlook Hotel, and the fact that whenever we see him and he's like, something seems off, and then
he serves the role as like a lifeline, you know what I mean? And they connect a few of those in there, and I know we need to talk about Scatman more, but the forestry people or whatever is also like a lifeline that's connected, and the telephones are like a lifeline that's connected, and in this movie, slowly some of those lifelines start to disappear.
Yes.
And like Scatman serves as one of those.
So. So I think, and he also just does a really good job.
Yeah.
Specifically, because again, I think he had a hard role to do, just to be kind of like the easygoing, laid back, but also has a lot of deep turmoil he starts to discover as he discovers the sense of uneasiness that seems to be going about. And again, he's not even at the Overlook Hotel. Yeah. He's like far, far away, and he's still having that. So I think it definitely helps do it a ton. Like that one scene where he's lying in bed and has to kind of like open his eyes.
Yeah, and like wake, like you can see that he's having a moment that looks like what Danny was having. They're both acting sort of the same moments, but they don't explicitly show things. Like he's seeing the girls by the blood elevator again or whatever. They don't have to do that for him because just by seeing him act that he has some sort of connection and he knows that something's going wrong at the hotel. So
yeah, I think he's definitely a great inclusion to have in the story. And again, it's performed very well.
Right. And I love it at the beginning whenever he's talking to Danny over ice cream and they're sort of talking about the powers, that he also plants one of those seeds of of ominousness, and that's about room 237. Yes. And he does so in such a way where Danny brings it up. And he's just like, I'm not scared of it, but don't you ever go near that door.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's like, don't you, no business in there. And you can see he gets like kind of mad about it a little bit, just to like scare, like, don't go by there, Danny. And of course that ends up being like one of the main plot hooks of the film is that room and the mystery that's contained in it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think pretty much like whenever it comes to other characters, I feel like there's a lot of like good notes specifically. I feel like every minor character in the film outside of the 3, possibly 4 if you include Scatman, does its role perfectly well and everything. I don't think there's a single actor that I felt like was weak, which is hard to do.
No, yeah.
It's hard to like go throughout a film and not find that one actor of like, okay, you could just...
I do feel like later on when you start getting to some of the characters where you wonder if they're real or not, those characters like the bartender and the butler, I do think some of those performances are maybe a little bit less memorable, but they're not bad.
Yes.
There's not like a bad performance.
No, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some lines they do that is memorable, but you're right. It's not quite as iconic that it sticks with you and you're thinking like, oh man, I love that one guy.
Yeah. I know I'm going to forget about like those two. Those are probably the next 2 main characters really. And then the people in the forestry service, those sorts of supporting roles.
Right.
I know I'm gonna forget about those next week, but I'm not gonna forget about Jack and Wendy.
Yeah.
And the head chef, who I can't even remember his name, but I remember his face.
Halloran. Yeah.
Halloran.
Yeah. Dick Halloran.
That's right.
Yeah.
Who's Dick Halloran calling?
Yeah. But
Family up there.
Oh my gosh.
Overton Hotel.
Thank you for that. Thank
Yeah.
you for setting the story straight.
Mhm.
So I know we've touched a lot on the film specifically whenever it comes to story wise and the sound department. One thing that I always think about this film specifically is visuals, and we've already
Right.
kind of alluded a little bit to it specifically with colors, but like even from the opening shot where it's like that aerial camera, which apparently Stanley Kubrick was afraid of flying, so he basically said, just go film it, just go.
Get it.
Doing stuff like that and just having establishing shots of the overlook hotel and the weather conditions outside and just following Danny around, just everything is gorgeous to look at.
Right.
Like it's like I've mentioned this before in previous films where I feel like I could pause it and it's like a painting I would like to look at, but like it's even more apparent. Like
Oh, yeah.
literally every frame is like
Are you
interesting
shouting
to
out
look at.
YouTube channel every frame a painting? Go subscribe to them right now on YouTube. that seriously makes sick content. I don't think they upload anymore, but they got some old stuff. Every frame a painting is a YouTube channel that I feel like you're just dancing around the name of.
Yeah, we're talking about your sponsored plug-in there.
Sponsored content. Every frame a painting. No longer uploading YouTube videos. I don't think. Maybe they are. I don't know.
Yeah. But I think with this film, it's visually just strong. Everything from just the overall look of the hotel and the rooms, everything is just perfectly shot. I love the angle Stanley Kubrick shoots from, whether it's following Danny behind on the bike or the use of the mirror they use in the Torrance's bedroom. I think and that's the thing, because it even shows that at the very beginning whenever Jack Nicholson is waking up and Wendy's bringing him breakfast, like they do that angle. And they didn't have to, but they did, and I appreciate it because we visit that angle multiple times, just seeing that constant reflection of Jack specifically.
They do that with a lot of things, visually and plot wise. They do foreshadowing in multiple modes. It's not even just with the dialogue and like, oh, old spooky cabin up there, people are gonna die here.
Yeah.
They also do it with like that shot that shows the window that plays a pretty big role towards the end of the film, where where Wendy and Danny are going through the maze and they have a whole thing where they're walking through the maze, and then the maze plays a pretty integral role later. And it's stuff that like there's not really any important dialogue happening there. They're just like showing the day-to-day life, and then it ends up becoming very important later. That sort of foreshadowing shots.
Yeah. I think because this film does take its time and doesn't try to hurry, because I feel like some films, understandably so, are afraid of lingering on shots for too long. But I feel like, again, this is just one of those films where it just works, and you don't mind if you're looking at Danny and Shelley Duvall watching TV,
right? And
they just don't say anything. They're just sitting there normally like any other family would do in silence, just watching it, just taking it in. But
I think it has a lot to do with the details that are in those scenes that they're showing. There's a lot of long shots in this, you know what I mean? And it's not just cutting from this to this to this to that, although there's certainly plenty of raw cuts. It's also, you're following Danny around on the bike. There's a lot of movement there. There's and there's that sound that we're talking about there. There's the color. There's so much to take in with every shot that I feel like is noticed, that is put in on purpose, that it doesn't get boring. Whereas a different film that didn't make all those considerations, that didn't think, okay, when Jack Nicholson's just throwing a tennis ball against the wall, you know what I mean? Like, that could be a really boring scene in another movie, but it's interesting because of what they have scattered along the floor and where he throws and what he discovers whenever he walks around this corner, you know what I mean? And then how that corner serves, again, it's another one of those foreshadowing moments, how that corner serves an important role later. Those sorts of rich details that are, with a Kubrick film, are intentional, you know what I mean? That are planted there for you to discover and to see again on rewatch and rewatch and rewatch is what makes those long shots. And what makes this 2.5 hour movie not feel 2.5 hours long?
Yeah, and I think that's very difficult to do because, again, there are like a lot of films, like for instance, David Lynch. I really like some of the work he does, but then there's other works like Mulholland Drive that I don't like at all.
Right.
And I understand what he's doing, but it doesn't make me appreciate it at all. I just feel like, again, I feel like you just wasted my time.
I love that you said it that way too, because there's a lot that's like that where I'll be like, I don't like that, and somebody will be like, well, you must not get what they're doing here. No, I get what they're doing.
Yes.
I just don't like it.
Exactly.
There's a difference there. You know what I mean?
So I think the fact that he is able to do so much, I mean, he's throwing lots of stuff there. And even though there are moments that I'm like, I don't know about that one.
Right.
There's just too many that are way too perfect. Like one of my favorite shots is whenever Jack Nicholson, has that tense fall and he's just going around the Overlook Hotel while Wendy and Danny go through the hedge maze, and then he looks at the diorama of the hedge maze, and it just zooms in, and it's a long shot of them zooming in, just an overhead shot. Again, not needed, but I think it helps establish the overall tone, mood, and imagery and stuff that Stanley Kubrick's trying to go for. So it's like a lot of those little moments there that makes the camera work just ungodly. I feel like it's
and that's especially in everything you're saying serves my earlier point about how if you looked at this script and somebody else tried to make it into a movie, it probably wouldn't be that great, because especially if you just looked at the dialogue, because so much of this is show don't tell. So much of this is Danny rolling up on the bike and looking at room 237 and feeling ominous about it or whatever, and there's no words being said there. There's just sound, there's shots, and there's movement, and that's it.
No, I think again, just being able to do all that and make it just gripping and interesting, it's very hard to do, and just it works. I mean, that's about the only thing I could say is that with this film, it works, and it hits a home run for me personally whenever it comes to doing all of that all together there. And so it makes it even enjoyable. Like even the tiny things that wouldn't even matter. It's not even like the big visual stuff, like looking at the hedge maze, stuff like that, or taking in the quiet moments. But like whenever Jack Nicholson walks down that hallway leading to the gold ballroom, it's different the second time round because it starts to look a little more smoky and everything. And I'm like, again, it's just like the tiniest thing, but it just helps elevate everything unbelievably. Right. So it definitely is just a visual treat to watch specifically. And of course, having that iconic elevator just open up and just fill the hallway with blood, which I never knew about this. I'll have to make sure to confirm it specifically, but they had that in the trailer, and initially the people are like, no, we're not going to show that in the trailer because it's blood, and we don't want a gratuitous amount of blood. I guess somehow I believe they told them, oh, that's just sewage.
Oh, it's just piss and shit.
I'm pretty sure.
Don't worry about it.
I'm pretty sure that's what it was specifically, and so then they're like, "Oh, okay."
Well, all right.
Like they allowed it, but like I'm so glad he just used so many of these like imagery stuff. And again, whenever you do see the more brutal moments, it is just very shocking and guttural overall, and just helps uncomfortable. Like one of my favorite shots, like angle wise, that I feel like this is just perfect. Like it is exactly perfect where it needs to be, is whenever Jack Nicholson leaves room 237 and it's leaving, and you see the door on the right side, and like the way he walks down the other way, and the way the light hits, it's just like absolutely perfect there. So I think it is just master craftsmanship whenever it comes to the cinematography department.
And even though this is classified as like a horror movie, and even for a horror movie that's like sort of famous for an elevator full of blood splashing, I wouldn't call it gratuitous. I wouldn't call it even like grotesque. Like maybe a graphic, you could I could stick that word onto
Yes.
it. But it's never unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's never like it doesn't feel like too much. Whereas another movie might, like the last episode we did was a very much a torture porn kind of situation, and it's like never even borders that. It's like still artistic all throughout. So.
No, I think that's definitely an interesting aspect. Speaking of aspects that I feel like you would be able to speak of, since this is kind of playing into it, for you personally as a whole, how scary is The Shining?
It's like it's not scary in a horror sense. I never see, like with this and with Alien, I never think of them as like horror movies until we broach them with this project. They're like suspenseful, right? And there's a difference to me in my mind, anyways, as an amateur watcher of these things. So like, if somebody was like, "Is this a scary movie?" If they worded it like that, I'd be like, "No." But like, there's definitely moments where you're like, "Ooh," you jump a little bit. Yeah, there's a lot of suspense, and it's thrilling in that kind of way. It's a little bit of a thriller, but it's I would definitely use the word suspense before I use the word horror or scary or anything.
Yeah, because that's been definitely a hot topic debate, is whether this is horror or not. Because for me, it is horror, but again, I don't really get scared of stuff specifically, but it's just, for me, it's like horror in the sense that it does make you feel just like terrified.
Right.
A little bit, not even just like scared. It's just like you're just really uneasy, and you're like, I don't know what's going on, and things are just kind of getting way more unsettling.
So here's where here's where something like Alien might be more horror, and maybe this less in some people's minds. Is I think horror is a genre for many, and this just doesn't have those genre conventions. You know what I mean? It is a suspenseful, intense, and at times there are some scary moments movie. It is about a guy that's trying to kill and does kill, it is made in reference of, so there are some of those tropes there. But overall, if you've showed this to a highfalutin film guy or something and asked if this was genre, they'd probably say no. Like, this isn't a genre film. When you think of hard genre, like, no, this is you can watch something and instantly be like, that's a romance. You watch something and instantly be like, that's a comedy. You watch something and be like, like this, I think this doesn't fit those sorts of conforms, even as much as like Alien did, where it was like, okay, this is very much, there's a killer on a ship that's chasing people down. You know what I mean? And you'll be like, okay, even though it's a great film, there's at least two genres you could slap it in immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
And this one might not have that. So that might be where some people draw that divide. I mean, the labels don't matter as much to me. I think you can call this horror as much as you could call Alien or anything else.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a solid point there. Do you think it would be, The Shining would be, like, if they could get past the abstractness of the film specifically, do you think that this film is palatable for those that aren't used to the horror genre?
Yeah. I mean, check the rating. If you don't want to watch a rated R movie because of blood and violence or whatever, then like, don't watch the movie. But it's a rated R movie for blood and violence or whatever. But it's not. It's probably one of the least intense ones in that respect, in bodily fluids and such respect, in violence respect, as it's probably one of the lesser ones that we've watched in those sorts of things. It is intense, it's sharp, but that intensity really is built by the film itself and the characters' performances, and less by like forcing you to see guts spill out of somebody's body or whatever.
No, for sure. Well, that's definitely good to kind of have, because it did always make me feel uneasy the first time I watched it, but I don't think I ever had nightmares, but I was kind of a little scared of it a tiny bit, because again, it just makes you feel uneasy.
Stuff. Yeah, and there's definitely moments that stick with you, and I think even like, so the iconic one that we talk about is like the two girls in the elevator of blood or whatever. Yeah, but those really aren't the ones that would like probably keep me up at night. It's some of the other scenes that I don't really want to spoil yet, but that are just like disturbing.
Yes.
Yeah, but not in like a, again, not in a flesh and violence and, horrific things kind of way, but rather in just like it feels like you just descended into hell and saw something like terrifying.
No.
Or more terrifying than horrifying, maybe.
Definitely it. So actually, speaking of spoilers, before jumping in, are there any last bullet points? I feel like we've talked extensively, more so than we have other films, because there's just so much to dig into.
Right.
Anything else you wanted to mention or add, whether it's something you liked or something you disliked about the film?
No, I think, the points I really wanted to talk about, we really have talked about so far.
I definitely agree. Like I said, I feel like, there's so much here to talk about, which is why people still talk about it to this day. And so I feel like we pretty much hit a lot of the bullet points and stuff that is in each category. Whereas it's kind of surprising to talk long about specific categories, whereas other films are like, here's these characters. Yep.
Yeah. That was a character, right? Because there's just so much depth in everything in this movie. And it's just a sign of how well crafted it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess with that note in mind, we'll go ahead and give the ratings before jumping into spoilers. So, Mr. Aaron, could you please provide us with the rating of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining?
Yes. So we've talked a lot about all the things I like. I would say this is a very near perfect movie. It's almost perfect. I don't know if I've ever, because I don't usually think about a rating immediately after walking out of the theater. So I don't know if I've ever seen a perfect movie. But this one comes really, really close. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. The reason I don't give it that extra 0.5 is not just because flippantly, like, well, I don't want to give something a 10. There are like a few edits that I don't really agree with. There are, and in the last half of the film, there is some pacing issues. It is a 2.5-hour movie.
Yeah.
Probably could have easily been even more effective of a movie if it was 2 hours and 15 minutes. I think you can cut some of that.
Yeah.
I think there's some stuff to trim, and it would have been more impactful because it does. First half of the movie, I think, is perfect. There are some parts in the second half that I feel like get a little sleepy.
For sure.
And yeah, but like really minimal things to count up.
Yeah.
I do think if I were to rate categories, I would give things like acting a 10. I would give things like sound design a 10. I'd give casting a 10. There's so many things that I would give cinematography 10. But there's little things. Editing might be more like an 8 or a 9. That really just bring the overall score down to a 9.5. But I mean, just absolutely fantastic movie.
Yeah, absolutely. So with my rating personally, I've told you before there is a movie that is a 10 out of 10 movie for me. And it's this film. Yeah, it's this film specifically. I even specifically chose this one because it's episode 10. 10 out of 10.
Hey.
Lots of 10s. But yeah, like the points you've mentioned, I can acknowledge. And I'm like, yes, I can agree with that. But as opposed to like films that are like a 9, that's like, yeah, like I personally don't like this, but I'll excuse it. This one is one moment of like, yeah, like the bear scene happened.
Yeah.
And then
I don't count off much for the bear scene because it's like
a quick thing. It's like there and gone.
It's like I wouldn't necessarily agree with that choice, but like it doesn't count off points for me. I'm like, okay, whatever. But, yeah.
No, but for me, this is a film that's a complete 10 out of 10 for me in the sense that I can't imagine living without it. It's a film that, again, just as soon as it starts, I'm like, I'm sold.
Yeah.
I'm sold already. As opposed to even Alien, where it takes a while for me to warm up before I'm like, all right, I'm hooked. The Shining, again, it's a great watch every time, and it feels like the very first time I've watched it before, and it's always great because even though I know the exact beats of what's going to happen and everything else, I still enjoy it and just eat up every single scene, every bit of dialogue spoken, every shot that is taken. This is a film that I cannot get enough of whatsoever. It is like just absolutely top notch in my regard. And while if there were like the changes to make it like the perfect film, I think it'd be fine, but I don't think it would heighten it better because again, the whole ride for me is just absolutely perfect. And so so it's definitely a solid recommendation for me. If you have not watched it, definitely check it out. Again, it is one of those abstracting films, because I know there's a lot of people that just like the more straight-laced story, the one that's like, familiar territory, not because this film is nothing like you've ever seen. Like, I can't really point out like any film that's exactly like The Shining.
No.
There are moments that remind me of other films, but there's just nothing else like it, which is why it's like one of the very few 10 out of 10s scores I give it. So yeah, definite hard, great, solid recommendation for me personally. And also, we watched it on the 4K disc, which I've seen it multiple times on the DVD, which has like Jack Nicholson's head pasted on there.
Yeah.
Which I've always thought was a goofy choice that they just put his
is
head.
Is it the one? Oh, from peeking through the...
Yeah, peeking through the door. I've always thought it was a strange choice.
That one is goofy, but I like why that one's iconic. The part that sorry, weird aside, the thing that I probably would have cut to is the scene. This is the part where he's.
We're not to spoiler territories.
Well, okay, first off, we're like a minute from spoiler territories. Second off, nobody would have known that was a spoiler if you didn't say, because he could have been for any reason. But he could have been. Anyway, there's a scene where he's at the end. Everybody's seen this picture too, and they probably thought it was from Home Alone 3. Because that's exactly what it looks like. It's the dumbest shot. They should have just photoshopped his eyes not to be going straight up. I don't know.
We're in spoiler territory, everyone. 4K's great. Go get the disc if you have a 4K player.
It was really nice. Except for there was a little part, I didn't mention anything about this before. I think sometimes whenever they remaster these things, there's some parts that look a little unnaturally smooth, a little too digital, in my opinion. And really, the opening sequence is the only part where I noticed that, the helicopter shots. It's like they stabilized it a little too smooth or something.
Yeah.
And I was just like, ooh, that looks like I'm watching it on a Blu-ray TV at Best Buy in 2010. But other than for the most part, really, only after the opening credits, I didn't notice any of those sorts of moments. And I thought it was really, really beautifully mastered.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to talk about spoilers, everyone. Talk about spoilers, boys and girls.
So I don't know if Coale beeped this part out or not, but Jack Nicholson's frozen face at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like a Home Alone movie. That's my take on it.
I laughed so hard about that because I was like, oh my God, you're right.
Yeah, it just looks dumb. Like, it looks like Kevin just poured a bucket of water on some guy in the cold, and he's like, it was just like, why? Why that face? I don't even object to the shot of him there in the morning, although you could easily just not have that shot too. But like, yeah, was that really his fate? Is he froze to death with his eyes rolled back in his head and a Jack Nicholson face? Like,
I mean, till the very end, amigo.
Yeah.
Till the very end. Even in death, he is joking it up.
Yeah. It was the Joker, baby.
Yeah, I can definitely see how it's goofy and stuff. I feel like it is kind of important just to establish, like, yeah, he's dead.
He did.
Like, absolutely dead.
Right.
No coming back from it. Which, speaking of being dead, the one thing, the very first time I watched this movie, it was on TV, and surprisingly, not a lot of it was edited out, so I got to see the entire of it. I think the only things that got cut out is older lady giggling in room 237 whenever she's like trying to grab Jack Nicholson, and the bear scene was gone. So whenever I saw it on DVD, I'm like, why don't I remember this? But
FCC probably didn't want those on television.
Probably not. But the one scene that absolutely stunned me is right after the scene where Jack Nicholson is frozen, which I do admit it is hammy looking. It does definitely look like Home Alone thing, but I feel like it works fine for the film. But whenever it transitions to the ballroom and it focuses on the picture, and it zooms in and it shows that, oh, Jack Nicholson's in this photo from 1921, coincidentally 100 years ago from when we're recording this.
Ooh,
well, not really, because it was July 4th, so a little over 100 years. Anywho, but the first time I watched it, I was like, I don't get it.
It's because he's always been part of the hotel. Yeah, because he had that monologue with the groundskeeper butler guy, and he's like, I recognize your picture. You cut up your family. And he was like, no, you're the groundskeeper. You've always been the groundskeeper. And so he kind of gets absorbed into the hotel there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the barkeep that says, like, your credit is good. Doing that stuff specifically, just alluding to the fact that he's been here before, which I think definitely helps a ton. But I also love that it's never super clear to where if you watch it once, you're like, got it.
Right.
And so I think that's what helps add to the rewatchability of The Shining and just the overall enjoyment is the fact that it doesn't tell you straight. And even whenever you do understand it, it's not like, oh, I understand everything that's going on.
Right. It doesn't spell it all out for you, and it doesn't ramp everything up in a nice bow. You're still not. You still don't really know at the end. Was that all in Knack Jickleson's head, or, you know, is it the hotel actually mystical? Because and normally you'd be able to answer those sorts of questions with like, well, Wendy at the end saw the because you get why the kid sees shit. Because that's his thing, is he has The Shining or whatever. And you get why Jack Nicholson sees shit, because he's going crazy, and Wendy discovers he's going crazy by reading all of his, you know, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and she's like, okay, this is like the final straw.
Yeah.
He's written, you know, hundreds of pages of this. He's psychotic, right? So you get why those two. But then when Wendy's running in the end, and like she's like keeps on running and seeing pictures of dead people and stuff, and then the hallways become, you know, ghostly or whatever.
Yeah.
Then you're like, oh, maybe it is part of the hotel. So that's sort of where I lean at the end, is that there is probably some magic to the hotel. But you could easily just say, well, Wendy has also just been through a lot of trauma after 5 months of isolation and emotional abuse. So like. And then, you know, at the end, her husband trying to kill her son and herself puts somebody in a state of psychosis. So, who's to say?
Yeah,
who's to say?
No, I definitely agree. Whenever Shelley Duvall is running through the hotel, and basically everything's hitting the fan, like everything's looking spooky, like whenever she's running through, feeling claustrophobic, again, I love the run that Shelley Duvall has, because again,
she's like breaking down while she's running. She's like, ugh.
Exactly, because again, she's not like, you know, just like track runner, you know, running through the Overlook Hotel. No, she's just can barely control herself while she's running, as she's sobbing and everything, which again might be annoying to some people, but I feel like if my husband was absolutely going bonkers unbelievably, and
it just works for her character, because she's so like mousy, and like Shelley Duvall's just like appearance in this movie just looks like that sort of like frail, like dependent woman, like, hi, I'm Shelley, you know.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
I just you don't expect her to just suddenly become like track star, because she doesn't look that way, you know. She doesn't look particularly, you know, survival oriented. She's like a, you know, emotional sort of keeping it together mom, and that's exactly how she, even when she's running in the end. Shelley Duvall definitely has that mousy personality, and it just works perfectly. And again, just for her to be experiencing all the craziness that's going on, because again, I think she's really been pretty light on the amount of like horrific imagery she's been basically objected to, but towards the end it's thrown all at her, because again, she has the bear sucking off the man scene, as we've mentioned several times. Now we can mention further. There's a guy in a bear mask. She's running through the hallways from her husband, who's trying to cut her up, and trying to find her son, who her husband is currently trying to cut up. And she, peeks into a bedroom, and there's some guy in a bear mask blowing another dude or something. And
and his butt flaps down and everything.
Yeah.
You see those golden hams sticking out from the fursuit.
Right. And that's the scene that I'm like, why'd you do that?
And people...
that's just absurdism for absurdism's sake.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, it's like one of those things I'm like, I don't really care what you have to say about this scene. I'm not going to dissect this one. We're just going to move right along.
Well, I wonder when he made Eyes Wide Shut, if it was right before this or right after this, you know what I mean? If he was just like, people in masks doing sex acts. That's what I want to make a movie about.
Yeah, just threw that in. But like her going through there, and then her seeing some of the dead hotel guests specifically, and having the foyer be covered in cobwebs and skeletons and clothing are everywhere.
She walks in and she sees the ballroom like full of life for a second, and then they're all dead, right? And then it's the cobwebs, and it's like the 80 years of decay or whatever.
And then she's the one that actually gets to see the blood exit the elevator, because pretty much it's been just an imagery that's been popping up in Danny's head specifically whenever he has like these premonitions going on. So just having that go on, I think, adds to the chaoticness towards the end, which I think it's definitely suiting. Like that's the way to build up tension, is the fact that everyone is becoming unhinged. Like obviously Jack Nicholson at that point has snapped and he's going around killing everyone. Wendy is just trying to survive, just basically going hysterical, just trying to figure a way out. And then Danny's just trying to run. He doesn't even know what he's supposed to be doing. He's a little boy. Like he just
well, he hides first. And this is what I love about the Shining, the way that it actually comes into play. It's not the main point of the movie, but it is an integral part, because Danny's hidden pretty well, but he has that connection to the head chef, who's like the last lifeline they have left, right? Because Jack Nicholson's taken care of all the other lifelines, or the phones have gone down in the storm too. The last lifeline he has left is that the head chef's coming, but he gets told in a fit of racism from this old hotel barkeep or whatever.
Yeah, gravy. Yeah.
he's like a black person's coming, but that's not the word he uses. And so he's like, I gotta fend him off. So then, it does that foreshadowing of the scene where he was throwing the tennis ball earlier and he peeked around that pillar. He's at that same pillar again. And I love the scene, so I'm just going to talk about it for a second.
Yeah, for sure.
A lesser movie would have focused on the head chef the entire time as he peeks into the hotel and he's looking around being like, anyone home or whatever. But this movie established him getting out of his car, or his little snowmobile, and getting into the movie. And then they followed Jack Nicholson for so long that even with all the scary music and the tension and everything, I wasn't worried about seeing Jack Nicholson kill the head chef, because I was looking at him. So I knew the camera had him framed up. I was like, okay, this isn't like a spooky moment where the killer pops out and stabs somebody, because I'm watching him. But then they cut back to him, and they spent so long on Jack Nicholson that I just wasn't worried about it anymore. Such that it caught me off guard again, even though I've seen this movie before, where the head chef walks around the corner, and then Jack Nicholson just turns around that pillar and just cleaves him in the stomach. And because he has that connection with the kiddo, he like screams because he feels getting axed in the chest too, and that reveals his location. So now he has to run because he was hiding before. So like that's how that plot point drives the movie. But at the same time, you could piece this together, and with genre conventions, think okay, so like because they established this early, and we know that the head chef is going to help, then that's how they get out alive or whatever. But like, that's the only person that dies.
yeah, that's really the only person that we see get killed, because there's like mentions of everyone else, which it's kind of like a bittersweet thing, because obviously you like Scatman, and so whenever you see him die, you're like, oh man. But it's also good in the fact that like he still provided a way for Wendy and Danny to leave the Overlook Hotel with a little snowmobile, which is kind of like the bittersweet thing about it. Is like Scatman died, but at least they were able to get away because he arrived. Because again, The Shining was the only reason why he even came, because otherwise there's no way they would have made it out alive. The snow was way too heavy for them to leave, and he just happened to arrive right at the moment that Jack Nicholson is finally just like, all right, good time to punish the family. You're going around. So I think it definitely adds to the overall craziness, is that you see all four of these characters just moving all around and about.
And I hadn't even thought about it this way, but there's two very distinct and separate branches of mysticism that are woven together. And that's The Shining, which is separate from the hotel, right? That's something that the head chef said that he and his grandma had as a child, and now he feels it with this kid too, and it's something that this kid felt before ever going to the Overlook Hotel or whatever. And then the Overlook Hotel seems to be like acting against that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's almost like The Shining is coming to save the family in some sense. It's like a lifeline, and then the Overton Hotel's like, actively trying to kill them.
Yes, exactly.
And those are the two like branches of like magical realism, the branches of mysticism within this universe that like are all that cross paths and cause this conflict.
No, I think it's definitely a good pairing, because basically having like these two mystical forces being at odds with one another, just basically having like that mystical power just to try to save them from a supernatural force, which is slowly corrupting Jack the longer he stays there, because it's not even like immediate, like he goes in, he's a bad guy. You just see his slow descent into madness, and there's moments where he's already beginning to possibly hallucinate, actually seeing ghosts at the hotel, and he doesn't like snap at that point. It's just the slow descent. It isn't until he's at the huge party scene specifically where it's like, I think we lose him.
Right. Because, it kind of displays itself as, like, you know, he's losing it a little. Like, he's talking to himself. He created a little imaginary friend to talk to the barkeeper or whatever, so that because he didn't want to talk to either of his family members who were there. So what other option did he have but to talk to himself? He kind of conjures that image himself. But as it goes on, it becomes more of like, this is the hotel's doing. It's got its grips with him.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that like, it's not necessarily that he's that bad of a guy, but that he is the embodiment of the hotel, even from the beginning, where they're like in the room and he's talking to Wendy and she's like, I'm kind of warming up to this place. And he's like, I felt like I always belonged here, you know? And then later on, they're like, you've always been the groundskeeper. So like, he is like, been magnetized to this hotel from the start, and his family are just the victims of it.
No, absolutely. And the thing that I find brilliant about this film is they could have easily just been like, oh yeah, the hotel's haunted, it's doing all this stuff, but it never sells it that way completely. Like whenever Wendy is able to knock out Jack and throw him into the pantry and close the door, and then, you know, Grady's talking to be like, it seems like you're in trouble there. Are you committed to killing your family now? And he's like Jack,
yeah, if I can get out.
Yeah, and then he gets out.
Right.
But it doesn't show the door opening or anything. You just hear it open.
Yeah, you hear the latch being undone. He's like, oh, so like, yeah. Those little things that are like confirmations that this isn't just in his head. Otherwise, how did he get out? You know what I mean?
Exactly. And then with him like having struggles like being off alcohol for 5 months, and then as soon as he is like, finally, I'd sell my soul for a drink, and he's talking to the ghost and has that scotch, you never know if he just imagined that or somehow, because it's so hard to put into words, but that's just what the greatness is of it, because they have that one scene the very first time where it's just a barkeep, nothing else is in the room, it's just a barkeep with all the bottles and everything, and then he tries to pull out money because he's like, I got $40, I can't spend anything on in here, and then he opens it and he's like, I seem to be short on cash, and then he doesn't have anything. Next shot, it shows the whole ballroom filled with a bunch of party goers, everything else.
And he has money.
Yes, he has money. He has money he pulls out specifically. And so it's just a question of what is real and what is not.
I feel like that's just, that's when the hotel's like taking the most hold of him. It's giving him things that he thinks he wants. But you see earlier, specifically with the hallucination in room 237, that like he snaps out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he goes into this room, he's already kind of like on the path to craziness, right? Because something happened to the boy where he has bruises on his neck, and it's a question of like, did Jack Nicholson strangle him? Or the boy says that there's a woman in a bathtub in this room that strangled him. So Jack Nicholson goes to investigate it. Of course, there's a butt-ass naked woman in the tub.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay. And there's a very long scene where she very slowly and dramatically gets out, and he very slowly approaches him. And it's all very dreamlike and surreal.
Yeah.
And he starts kissing, and the camera sort of angles and really goes around them. And then he starts to look disgusted, and he sees in the mirror the back of her and just this old woman that's decaying. And he realizes he's kissing this. It's like the classic mythos of the siren song or whatever, or harpies, or of all these different mythical creatures that lure you in and then are actually disgusting old hags. And the hotel itself seems to be this sort of succubus, but he breaks from that, and he's like, God. But then he goes right to the Wendy and all them, and they're like, what happened? He's like, nothing at all. There was nothing there.
Yeah, and that's just the great thing about this film in particular, is seeing Jack Torrance, like, give in to these kind of, quote-unquote, like, his demons and stuff, whether it is through just alcoholism or the fact that, you know, he does choose to, like, make out with this woman just because it's just that instinct of like doing so, but he's also like pulling back a little bit, like he's not giving in entirely. It's like even whenever he's having the nightmares right before it's revealed about Danny having the bruise around his neck, and he's just like, I had the most awful dream that I killed you guys, and you could tell he's genuinely disturbed and he's not happy.
He's remorseful. He's like, I feel awful, like something happened where I killed
and it's probably the most vulnerable you probably see him feel and stuff before he's in too far. And so I think it's just incredible just getting to see all those moments, specifically as the hotel itself just starts to pull out the worst in him, as it just kind of overall consumes him to where he's just basically lost it mentally.
Even like pretty shortly before he starts going on an action spree, when he's in the bathroom with Grady, the butler or whatever, and he recognizes him, he's like got this kind of conversation going with him where he's like, you killed your whole family, and like you're a fucked up dude, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and then Grady just slowly turns the conversation into like, that wasn't me. But then but then like slowly is like, when I did take care of my family, I did it because it needed to happen or whatever. And like, it sounds like you need to take care of your family. And he's like, yeah, you're kind of right. And you know, so like even the conversation started, you can see that temptation, you know, and there's a lot of those moments of the hotel tempting him in one way or another.
No, and
whether it's alcohol or sexuality or at the very end, murder.
Yeah, because that's just the crazy thing about it, is the fact that you feel like you get to see into the inner psychosis of Jack himself, because he has these monologues, mostly with the ghost, because usually with like his family, he's either just typically hateful towards Wendy, even whenever he is sane, like whenever he's frustrated about, you know, he's on a roll typing and then someone comes in, Wendy comes in just trying to be nice and stuff, and then he just gets furious with her just because he is like, you made me lose my stride, basically. And then like you hear the way he talks about Wendy whenever he's talking to the barkeep, being like, oh yeah, that old sperm bank upstairs. I'm like, Jesus.
Can you tell he's gonna be the axe murderer by the end of the film?
So I think it's just so interesting just to see like the struggle, because again, because he's established as not like upstanding gentleman sort of dude again, but also the fact that he's not absolute total like worst person in the world per se, but just seeing him slowly just become a monster towards the end.
Worse and worse.
Because
that first time we see him is like in a job interview, and he's like, hey, I'm a nice guy or whatever. So we're literally seeing him at the part where he's like trying to model his best behavior, and it just goes downhill the more you go through the film, where he loses having to do that. And then also interesting to note that like pretty much everyone in this film, with the exception of the kid, like is under incredible amounts of sleep deprivation.
Yes.
Like, and so you have to wonder, like, the isolation and sleep deprivation, that's what's causing these hallucinations or whatever.
Exactly. And it never tells you like one way or another, but it provides evidence for both factors, again, which could seem like it's contradicting itself, but it never feels that way to me specifically. It just keeps everything super duper vague, again, kind of like overall Jack's feelings, and the fact that like whenever it comes to his own family, how much he truly loves them. Because with Wendy, it's questionable like whether the love is still there between them. I'm pointing to probably not so much, if he's willing to talk like that. But with Danny, he speaks of him pretty fondly, and he's like, it was one time I heard him. That's it. I love that little bastard.
Well, even exactly. Whenever he starts talking about it in the first place, he says he loves him, but there's those little hints of like, you could tell he'd be violent again.
Oh, for sure.
Where he's like, I love the little bastard. You know? And he's like, wow, interesting choice of words. You know, and he does that twice. I can't remember the second thing he calls him, but he says it in sort of like, I would never hurt him. You know, much or like he says it in a way where it's like, wouldn't you though?
Yeah, and again, it just kind of, it makes you follow him down the path and you understand why he's going around killing his family now, specifically, because basically the hotel has convinced him that's what he needs to do.
Right.
Which again, a lot of people in real life go through something like that, where they have like this unnatural force telling them to do something, and in their head they're like, "You're right."
You know what?
Yeah.
I might as well. Yeah.
And so I think like, again, like they could have easily taken some of the details of it, like the fact that the family was killed. It could have been a throwaway line just foreshadowing what's going to happen, but it plays a bigger part in it overall, because again, you get to see like the twin girls. Those are the daughters that got killed by the dad.
Technically, asterisks, not twins. I said twins in the beginning. I realized when we watched this movie, he specifically says they're age 8 and 10. Not twins.
Okay.
But they're in identical outfits.
Yes, and they look pretty dadgum similar. So yes, sisters killed in the hallway. And again, like, it just works out in the film's favor overall, selling everything and all the characters and everything else. Yeah, this film just has so much to dissect and dig into specifically. But it is... I love Jack Nicholson. I will say probably if I had to pinpoint his weakest moment is whenever Danny manages to lose him in the snow maze and he's like, Danny!
Yeah.
And he's just
like
incoherent screaming.
Yeah, he just becomes a caveman.
But I also like it a ton. So that's just the weird thing about the film is like, okay, it's a little goofy, but I like it.
Yeah.
So with the movie The Shining, obviously I've mentioned several times before that it was a novel written by Stephen King, and so I know you haven't read The Shining, right?
I haven't.
Okay, so I haven't fully read it either. It's been one of those like books I need to get to specifically. I just never get to at all.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. So obviously, it sounds like you really like The Shining, right? Yeah, I like it a lot. So guess who's one of the people that really dislikes it?
Who?
Stephen King.
Oh,
yeah.
I imagine it's a lot different than.
Oh
his
yeah,
book.
yeah. It is completely different. So whenever it comes to being a faithful adaptation, from what I've heard of the bullet points, because I saw like a quick review of the mini series or made for movie TV that Stephen King did for The Shining, almost as a retaliation, just like, no, this is
what it would look like if I did it.
Yeah, exactly. Because Stephen King actually sent Stanley Kubrick a lot of scripts and stuff, specifically just being like, hey, here's what I do. And he just turned it away. But Stephen King would receive calls early in the morning, like super early, from Stanley Kubrick, just grilling him about questions about stuff specifically. So, you know, again, that's just kind of Stanley Kubrick just kind of had unethical ways of making films, but
to say the least.
There's
a little bit to say about like even famous authors, like that would probably still happen. They could probably still get ignored anyways if anyone else was making that movie, because it really, like, honestly, J.K. Rowling's one of the first people that like had a significant say on how their books were adapted to the screen, because usually you just like you sign away the rights and then it's like, go fuck yourself, this is my movie. You know what I mean? And that's how it's been forever. But yeah, so that's interesting, that that two-sided nature of like, I don't care what you write me, but I'm gonna call you in the middle of the morning. And
yeah, it would just be kind of like random, and I think it was just Stanley Kubrick, just, you know, his thought process is, because I mean, you watch the movie, I mean, we've talked endlessly about it, people have specifically. And so there's obviously a lot depth to it, but just the amount of like stuff he had to do. But it is kind of weird because he's like, I don't want your help, but I want your help. And so with that kind of just toxic nature that Stanley Kubrick kind of had towards Stephen King, because here's the interesting thing. I actually saw an interview with Stephen King, because I actually like him a lot. I think he's kind of a chill dude, even if he has opinions. With The Shining, I can't remember who it was. I don't know if it was like Conan or somebody specifically, but they asked him, like, with The Shining, do you think it's a bad film because it's a bad adaptation, or it's just a bad film? And he's like, it's just a bad film. I don't get it. So it's not even like he just despises the movie, and he's calmed down about it after, years and years, because I'm sure like with the
He's gotta
fan
just
base
be
that
salty. I mean,
yeah, because I think for him it was one of those things that writing it, he had like certain aspects in mind about who the characters were and
Yeah.
everything. Like I believe that I want to say like it was either Jack Torrance was either his dad or it was actually himself, because he had kids, specifically Stephen did, and so it's kind of like a self-reflection of himself in the book, because apparently Stephen King had a terrible relationship with his father, which is why I'm thinking I believe he said that Jack Torrance was kind of inspired by himself. Again, just kind of that overall kind of protector, kind of going against the people he's kind of meant to protect specifically.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, again, with how Jack Torrance's portrayal is, it's not very like, it's likable, but not like, oh, he seems like an upstanding gentleman with good morals. He's kind of starts a movie off as a jerk and then goes there. So it could be just the fact that it took like the material that had special meaning to Stephen King, and it seemed like it kind of got reformed into something else. Like it just got slaughtered, and Stanley Kubrick just kind of formed it into its own Frankenstein-like creation.
Yeah.
So that's what I think. But it is interesting just to see Stephen King just straight up say it's a bad movie.
How does he feel about? Because there's been lots of really, really critically acclaimed titles that were adaptations of Stephen King novels. So I wonder what he feels about like Green Mile or like Shawshank Redemption. Or...
Yeah, he kind of has like mixed stuff. Specifically, like I know whenever they came out with the new It films and stuff, both films, he was very happy with how they went about adapting it, even though there were changes from the book specifically.
What about the old ones?
So they're very hit or miss, but I don't think there's any film he despises more than The Shining. The Shining is just the epitome of everything he hates. And
he probably just fucking hates Stanley Kubrick.
Dude, I think he really does. I genuinely think, because I mean,
it's probably a long list of people that have personal vendettas against that guy. But...
No, for sure. And so I think it's kind of interesting because you have a film that's like highly acclaimed and everything. Because it's one thing if an author doesn't like the movie that they adapted because they just did everything wrong and the audience hates it as well. Like it's just a bad adaptation.
Right.
But whenever you have a movie that takes a book as inspiration and not really adapts it, but I mean, obviously we talked about how The Shining was kind of a mixed bag whenever it came out. Like people like critiqued the hell out of it, but then later on it's now considered like one of the greatest masterpieces in cinematic history. Sure. So it's just kind of interesting whenever it comes to the idea of adapting a book for film and just having something like this to where the author just straight up despises it and hates it.
It's far from the worst an adaptation could be. It's way much on the good side of what an adaptation could. There's so many funny stories of like Gary Paulson. I'm pretty sure it was Hatchet or one of his famous novels that he wrote that somehow got turned into Disney's Sled Dogs with Snow Dogs. With Cuba Gooding Jr. And he's just like, he's like, I just sold the rights away or whatever. He like wrote a screenplay, sold the rights away, and it just like completely changed everything about it pretty much except for there are some snow dogs in Alaska running or whatever. Like that's pretty much the only thing that stayed the same. It suddenly turned into a story of like a dentist trying to go,
God, you're sending mad flashbacks.
So like at least you didn't get snow dogs, you know what I mean? Like it's like a passionate story that was like very directly tied to the content of your novel. It's not like just loosely inspired and you have to suffer through a made-for-TV Disney movie. But I think it is just interesting how that process goes, and so that's why I think something like this is very unique to happen, where the author despises it, but people have grown to sincerely love it. But I think it also comes that, they're both pretty strong
minded. And the thing I can respect about Stephen King is that you didn't even know he hated The Shining at all. And so it's one of those things that he just doesn't like talking about it at all. So, and he doesn't like try to start up stuff where he's like, no, I want this film removed. He's just like, I absolutely hate it, but I'm moving on. I figured I found this quote here. I figured you would like. He's like, one of the issues he had was Jack Torrance. It's like, when we first see Jack Nicholson, he's in the office of Mr. Ullman, the manager of the hotel, and then he's crazy as a shit house rat. And all he does is get crazier. And I actually saw a video on this from Eye Patch Wolf, where, he's talking about The Shining specifically. And Stephen King actually hit a line, which I agree with Super Eye Patch Wolf, where he had the line whenever the movie came out, he's like, The Shining is a film that's meant to hurt you. Which I would definitely agree. It's not a feel-good film by any means of the word, but I think it's definitely interesting just looking as a whole whenever it comes to that. So I definitely wanted to hit that point because I feel like it's an important point to discuss, especially dealing with adapting and it becoming something else, but actually it's even more than what we could have ever expected. There's definitely a lot to look at this film overall, and the way it spirals out of control, and all those little moments, like again, like you mentioned before, whenever Wendy is like finally able to see what he's typing there, and it's like all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, which, by the way, I guess Stanley Kubrick filmed multiple different versions of it for foreign countries, so that way it would translate well. Specifically. So the more you know on that one, but like it just works so well because even though, again, I feel so bad about Shelley Duvall shooting that bad scene 127 times, and you could tell the distress in her face specifically.
She looks exhausted, but I think that's the point.
Yes, exactly. And they just both do so well in the fact, and they sell it. They absolutely sell the heck out of it. And so just with this film, I mean, obviously we've talked this long about it already. There's just so much to look at and love about this film, and people are still going to talk about this film to the end of the days. I'm pretty dadgum sure on that front. Before wrapping up this wonderful chaotic episode, kind of like The Shining, is there anything else you would like to mention since we are in the free range zone?
Free range.
Pick any spoilers crops we got going on over there.
She could totally fit through that window. She just need to try a little harder.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was thinking through, like, maybe bust the window out.
You know what I do want to mention? While we're just in the things that don't matter territory, I want all the paintings that were in the head chef's house.
those were terrific.
Yeah, like the first one you see the lady with a huge afro.
Dude, the afro is as big as her body almost. Yeah, it's crazy.
And just butt-ass naked. I kind of want to just fill my house with those and see what people say when they come in. I don't really have the complexion to pull that off, but it's a vibe, and I kind of want a big afro naked lady room in my house.
And it's so funny because they could have just not had that in there. Because again, Scadman Crowther's character is never sold as like, I'm for the ladies type deal. He's not, but they just have it there. He has one right at the foot of the bed.
I love his whole house. He's in like a little cabin looking thing, and he's like, there's like an ibex on his wall, and like it's just weird. Like it gives him some sort of character that's like not necessary, but again, like it's still like nice details to throw in. That makes sense that he lives in a place like that. He's a head chef at a fancy hotel that serves presidents and stuff. Of course, he's going to be a little eccentric in his home.
No, so I think that's a funny point to mention, but yes.
And everybody wears wool ties too. What happened to wool ties? Bring them back.
I know, just bring them back.
Anyway. That's all I wanted to mention.
Yeah. No, you're good. You're good. I do like the one song they do include whenever they're playing at the ball scene and then at the very end of the movie, I feel like it's very appropriate for the film. So another major kudos over to Mr. Stanley Kubrick for throwing that one in.
Right, it just feels old. It feels like old money, you know what I mean? It's kind of classy, that sort of ballroom music that they put in, but it's also fucking, like, creepy, too. Yeah.
No, exactly. But yeah, I think that's pretty much a lot of the points we could talk about. Again, it's one of those films that I could just keep talking on and on about. I'm sure there's a lot of other points to mention, but I feel like I've mentioned overall the points that I do want to make. Great film, great cast, great pretty much everything for me. Definite high recommendation. Will always be probably one of my favorite films of all time, period.
Go watch it.
Yeah, definitely go watch it. Please. Por favor.
All right.
Yeah, so are
Tease
you...
me.
Yeah.
Tickle my nipples. Let's go. Ooh.
So we're actually
What's
going...
next?
So I actually took time to really, like, analyze and look at what episode we're going to do next. And I believe the next episode we should do is another film that appeared the very next year in 1981. And it's definitely not as quite abstract as The Shining is specifically, but it is another slasher film that maybe you have or have not heard about, depending on it. And it also focuses on a particular holiday.
80s slasher holiday, huh?
Coming up kind of soonish, but not that soonish.
The Martin Luther King Day Killer.
A little further.
St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Close. Because we're going to be watching My Bloody Valentine from 1981.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. So, guys, thank you guys so much for listening to this longer than usual episode of Poppin the Scary, and we will see you all again next time when we're Poppin the Scary with My Bloody Valentine.
Yeah.
All right. Woohoo!
You just got gnomed! No!
Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube, Castbox, or iTunes platforms to stay up to date when new episodes drop. To see what Aaron and I are up to, check out our respective Twitter accounts. For me, it is @ColeKirkVA, and for Aaron, it is @AnimalGameDev. Thank you all so much for listening to our podcast. We'll speak to you all again next time when we're Poppin' the Scary.